Lecture 2, 3 Ways of Looking at Discourse. Over the years, people have approached the study of discourse in many different ways. Scholars who analyze discourse have basically gone about it from 3 different perspectives, based on 3 different definitions of what discourse is. Some have taken a formal approach to discourse, defining it simply as language above the level of the clause or sentence. Those working from this definition often try to understand the kind of rules and conventions that govern the way we join clauses and sentences together to make texts. Others take a more functional approach, defining discourse as a language in use. This definition leads to questions about how people use language to do things, like make requests, issue warnings, and apologize in different kinds of situations, and how we interpret what other people are trying to do when they speak or write. Finally, there are those who take that what we might call a social approach, defining discourse as a kind of social practice. What is meant by this is that the way we use language is tied up with the way we construct different social identities and relationships, and participate in different kinds of groups and institutions. It is tied up with the issues of what we believe to be right and wrong, who has power over whom, and what we have to do and say to fit it to our societies in different ways. Although these 3 different approaches to discourse are often treated as separate, they are certainly associated with different historical traditions and different individual discourse analysis. The position we take is that good discourse analysis requires that we take into account all 3 of these perspectives. Instead of 3 separate definitions of discourse, they are better seen as 3 interrelated aspects of discourse. The way people use language cannot really be separated from the way it is put together, and the way people use language to show who they are and what they believe cannot be separated from the things people are using language to do in particular situations. Language above the clause. The use of the term discourse to mean language above the level of the sentence or the clause probably originated from the linguist Zelig Harris, who back in the 1950s wanted to take the study of linguistics to a new level. Before this, linguists had come a long way in understanding how sounds are put together to form words and how words are put together to form sentences. What Harris wanted to do was to understand how sentences are put together to form texts. The idea that texts could be analyzed in terms of their formal structure was actually very popular in the early and mid-20th century, even before Harris invented the term discourse analysis, especially in the field of literature. The method that Harris proposed was the analysis of discourse, which he called distributional analysis, was not much different from how people go about doing grammatical analysis. The idea was to identify particular linguistic features and determine how they occurred in texts relative to other features, that is, which features occurred next to other features or in the same environment with them. However, Harris's ambitions were beyond simply understanding how linguistic features are distributed throughout texts. He was also interested in understanding how these features correlate with non-linguistic behavior beyond texts, that is, how the form that texts take is related to the social situation in which they occur. It was really left to discourse analysts who came after him, however, to figure out exactly how the relationship between texts and social contexts in which they are used could be fruitfully studied. When focusing on the formal aspect of discourse, we are mostly interested in how the different elements of texts or conversations are put together to form unified wholes. In this respect, we usually look for 2 kinds of things. We look for linguistic features, words and grammar, which help to link different parts of the text or conversation together, and we look at the overall pattern of the text or conversation. We can refer to these two things as cohesion, how things of the text are stuck together, and coherence, the overall pattern or sequence of elements in a text or conversation that conforms to our expectations about how different kinds of texts or interactions ought to be constructed. Language and use. The second aspect of discourse that discourse analysts focus on is how people actually use language to get things done in specific contexts. In fact, it is often very difficult to understand what a piece of language means without referring to the social context in which it is being used and what the person who is using it is trying to do. This view of discourse grew out of the work of a number of important scholars, including Michael Halliday, whose approach to the study of grammar differed markedly from early approaches by focusing less on the forms language takes and more on the social functions accomplished by language, and the work of the British philosopher John Austin and Paul Grice, who laid the foundation for what we call pragmatics, the study of how people do things with language. Another important figure who promoted this view of discourse is the applied linguist Wiedenson, who approached the whole problem of language use from the perspective of language learning, noting that learning a foreign language requires more than just learning how to make grammatical sentences. It also involves being able to use the language to accomplish things in the world. There are a number of ways to study language and use. One way is to consider discourse itself as a kind of action and to explore how, when we say things or write things, we are actually doing things like apologizing, promising, threatening, or making requests. Another way to consider language is to use it to explore the role of discourse in certain kinds of activities and to examine how different kinds of discourse make certain kinds of actions or activities either easier or more difficult to perform. Finally, we might consider how people use discourse strategically to try to communicate their interpretation of a situation or to manage their relationships with the other people with whom they are communicating. Language and social practice. The third aspect of discourse has to do with the role of language in social practice. Language is seen not just as a system for making meaning, but as a part of larger systems through which people construct social identities and social realities. Different people use language in different ways. An English teacher talks differently than a hip-hop artist, and these different ways of talking help to show who we are and also reflect our different ideas about the world, different beliefs, and different values. This view of discourse probably owes the most to the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who argued that discourse is the main tool through which we construct knowledge and exert power over other people. Different kinds of discourse or discourses are associated with different kinds of people and different systems of knowledge. Foucault spoke, for example, of clinical discourse, economic discourse, the discourse of natural history, and psychiatric discourse. The American discourse analyst James G. used a capital D to distinguish this view of discourse from the others. For him, discourses are the ways of being in the world, or forms of life which integrate words, acts, values, beliefs, attitudes, and social identities. This aspect of discourse leads us to explore how people use language to advance certain versions of reality and certain relationships of power, and also how our beliefs, values, and social institutions are structured through and supported by discourse. A certain principle of this view of discourse is that discourse is always ideological, meaning that discourse always has an agenda, that is, always ends up serving the interests of certain people over those of others. So, it is difficult to look at discourse in any meaningful way from only one of these perspectives. Simply looking at how texts are put together, for example, while it may be interesting, has limited practical value. At the same time, you cannot really make broad statements about power or ideology in a text without first understanding some basic things about how the text is put together and how people are actually using it in specific social contexts to perform specific actions.